This is the History of the World podcast with me, Chris Hasler. And you're listening to Volume 3, The Classical World. Episode 46, The Severan Dynasty. The Roman Empire had enjoyed a period of comparative and sustained stability throughout most of the 2nd century, after the deposition of the unimpressive Domitian at the end of the 1st century. The most dangerous threat that the Roman Empire faced during this period of relative peace was a plague which ravaged the population for a period of 15 years. The emperor who steered Rome through this difficult period was a man called Marcus Aurelius, and no sooner had he brought Rome out the other side of this time than he died. He would leave the empire to his actual son, Commodus. As we found out last week, Commodus was a bad emperor. He seemed more concerned about trying to turn himself into the greatest human that ever lived by renaming everything after himself. Rather than winning campaigns against great foreign military leaders and annexing their land like Thutmose III, Alexander the Great and Trajan, he decided that he could cement his reputation by winning questionable gladiatorial battles in the city's amphitheatre. After executing a number of people over the years who he believed were plotting against him, everyone decided that enough was enough, and so they poisoned him before strangling him in his bath on New Year's Eve 192, and that was the end of Commodus. Much speculation had been made about the murder of Commodus and the veracity of some of the detail, but if we are to believe what we read, then we can determine that the plot to kill Commodus was instigated by the Praetorian Guard prefect, Letus. There doesn't appear to be any report of major consequences to any individuals involved, which seems to suggest that the assassination of Commodus was a popular one, with many of the great statesmen of the empire probably tired of watching Rome move backwards under a megalomaniac monarch. Very soon after Commodus's murder, Letus proclaimed the prefect of the city of Rome, a man called Pertinax, as the new emperor. Pertinax had the support of the Praetorian Guard, and he moved to get approval from the Senate, which he did. As a man in his 60s, he should come with all the worldly wisdom and lack of egotism that would bring stability and humble but firm governance of the empire, much in the same way that Antoninus Pius or Vespasian had done before him. Pertinax would attempt to make financially responsible decisions, such as reallocating lands that had remained unoccupied since the plague of the 160s and the 170s had devastated the population. Pertinax would ensure that he worked closely with the Senate, using public money for public means, and not looking after all his old cronies in the military legions, as they were hoping he would. An uprising of soldiers marched on the imperial palace in protest, where they stormed in, and one of them would murder the emperor in a shocking act. The new emperor was dead, less than 90 days after taking power. The events that happened next were somewhat unthinkable when we think about how stable and organised the role of Roman emperor appeared to be throughout the 2nd century. Following the death of Pertinax, the role of Roman emperor was auctioned off by the Praetorian Guard to the highest bidder. The problem is that it seems that not everybody was notified of, had the opportunity to take part in, or even necessarily gave their approval to the auction. We often see provincial governors looking to step up and throw their hat in the ring when it comes to an imminent vacancy at the very top. and it seems as though they were not welcome to take part in this Praetorian auction, and the winner was a man called Didius Julianus. Effectively, what had happened here is that the military within the city of Rome held the post of emperor to ransom. They sold the post and intimidated the Senate into ratifying the outcome. The citizens of Rome were not so happy though, especially when Julianus started devaluing silver. The discontent would also be shared by the military in the provinces, who would start supporting their respective governors as the right man for the job. Civil War. The Roman governor of Pannonia was the first to react, and this was possibly due to his closer proximity to Rome than those who considered themselves rival claimants from Britannia and Syria. His name was Septimius Severus. Julianus declared Severus a public enemy in order to rally Rome against the threat of a potential invasion. The Praetorian Guard were effectively former legionaries in the twilight of their careers, so how well they would have stacked up against an active Roman legion is a subject for debate, but they would have had to have been called to arms to protect the current emperor if Severus was to march on Rome. Severus was wily though. He secured the loyalty of a potential rival claimant, the Roman governor of Britannia, Claudius Albinus, by promising to make him the junior emperor. Severus would also take control of some naval resources after defeating one of the Praetorian prefects sent to head him off. Julianus quickly realised that the odds were heavily stacked against him. Severus was able to march into Rome, where the Praetorian Guard were very little resistance against Severus's legions. Severus pledged to show clemency towards the Praetorian Guard as long as they defected from their loyalty to Julianus and surrender those responsible for the murder of Pertinax. Those men were executed, and the rest of the Praetorian Guard were dismissed, and Julianus was decapitated, bemused about why he deserved death, wondering what he'd really done wrong. One man who may have been disappointed by this sequence of events was the Roman governor of Syria, whose name was Pescennius Niger. When Pertinax was murdered, his own legionaries were quick to declare their own man as the new emperor. Indeed, the citizens of Rome saw him as the natural choice to come to their rescue and depose Julianus. However, due to the fact that Severus reacted so swiftly, Niger was left in the background and watched helplessly while Severus took what should have been his own throne. Severus was fully aware of the fact that Niger would have had these feelings and knew that as the new emperor, Niger would have to be his first priority. Niger would set about securing the loyalties of the eastern provinces, including the wealth of the Egyptian province, which was also useful for denying supplies to Rome. So Severus kidnapped the children of Niger to use as bargaining chips and ordered those troops loyal to him in Egypt to prevent supplies heading east to Niger. So this was now an East versus West civil war on the same kind of scale of that when Octavian and Mark Antony were effectively competing for the same prize over 200 years previous. The two emperors, one ratified and the other self-proclaimed, knew that one of the key strategical cities on this occasion would be the city of Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul, standing on the Bosporus Strait, which is the last waterway to traverse before gaining access to the resource-rich coastal trading ports of the Black Sea. For Niger, it was a good power base, and for Severus, it would cripple Niger's claim if he could take the city himself. With Albinus on side, Severus's forces approached Byzantium, and Niger knew that he was on the back foot, so he tried to negotiate with Severus. Severus was not particularly interested. He had come to eliminate this eastern threat. The Severan forces besieged Byzantium, and Niger fled with his army. Severus's forces pursued Niger and his army, forcing Niger's army to continue to withdraw until the ultimate meeting at the Battle of Issus in 194. Let's not get this confused with the Battle of Issus from back in episode 19, when we described how Alexander the Great of Macedon defeated Darius III of Achaemenid Persia. The location was similar, but the result was a defeat for Niger. Niger himself was chased down by Severus's military and was decapitated, with his head taken back to the besieged city of Byzantium, which eventually fell to Severus, who ruined this resistant city. This victory gave Severus some great impetus to believe that he could press eastwards and take on the traditional enemy of Rome, the Parthians. If you wanted to be regarded as one of the greatest Roman emperors who ever lived, then victories against the Parthians would surely cement this as part of your eternal legacy. However, it does seem that Severus might have had half an eye on Albinus, who as junior emperor was promised the imperial throne after the reign of Severus. In actual fact, it may have been the case that Severus had played a clever game of placating Albinus while dealing with Niger, before turning hostilities against Albinus, who was simply another rival for the throne in truth. The reality of the situation was clear when Severus declared Albinus an enemy of the state for whatever reason he could create, and proclaimed his son Caracalla as the new junior emperor and successor for the imperial throne. Albinus didn't need to be a genius to know how this would potentially play out if Severus was in control of proceedings. Albinus proclaimed himself as the true Roman emperor in a bid to rally support to his cause, and so Severus and Albinus were now in open conflict. Albinus was based in his power base in Britannia, and so he would have to cross the channel and take control of Gaul before moving on to Rome. He would have the support of his legions in Britannia and a number of Roman senators who favoured Albinus. After moving across the water into Gaul, Albinus would have to bring more people onto his side. The ultimate clash of these two men took place at the Battle of Lugdunum in February 197. Lugdunum is the modern French city of Lyon. Accounts suggest that this was one of the greatest Roman battles, with each army consisting of well over 50,000 individuals. The battle itself was epic, likely going on for multiple days. It appears that Severus used his cavalry to good effect, and the forces of Albinus suffered significant losses as a consequence. Albinus fled to the city, where he was either killed or committed suicide. Either way, the threats to the Roman emperor had now been dealt with. Not only had Niger and Albinus been killed, but Severus had made sure that their families were killed too. Not a lot of mercy shown there. Both Britannia and Syria were split up into smaller provinces by Severus, likely to prevent any further individual uprising. This meant that Severus could now give some serious attention to the Parthians, to whom he had not been able to put his full military energy into since defeating Niger in 194. Now he had eliminated all threats, he could concentrate on Parthia. Severus would hope to emulate one of his predecessors, Trajan, and venture down the Euphrates River or the Tigris River into the heart of the Parthian Empire, creating a new Mesopotamian province. Although Severus did not conquer southern Mesopotamia and reach the Persian Gulf like Trajan, he did establish a Roman province of Mesopotamia in northern Mesopotamia. Later years. The situation by which Septimius Severus came to be the outright emperor of Rome is probably the highlight of his story. The Roman Empire was carried into the 3rd century on his shoulders, and his son Caracalla now being prepared to be his successor. The historian Cassius Dio was also a statesman of Rome, and not only was he a contemporary of Septimius Severus, but he was also an opponent of him. Cassius Dio tells us in his writings of a character called Bulla Felix, who instigated a revolt in southern Italy against the Emperor Septimius Severus. However, some have doubts about whether Bulla Felix was actually real or whether he was simply a work of fiction. We could compare him to someone like Robin Hood, who is a folklore legend and with no guarantee that he was ever a real person. The comparison to Robin Hood does not really stop there though. Bulla Felix led a group of bandits around 600 strong, conducting robberies while deliberately avoiding killing their victims. He would then take the spoils of his crimes and distribute the wealth among the poor. Septimius Severus is reported to have made it his personal responsibility to capture this Bulla Felix, but this was all the more difficult because Bulla Felix was also a master of disguise. Bulla Felix continued his criminal antics for around 2 years, successfully avoiding capture, but eventually a Praetorian prefect saw through one of his disguises, and so he was arrested before being sent to the Colosseum to be ceremonially torn apart by wild beasts for the entertainment of an audience containing many of his victims. And that was the end of Bulla Felix. Severus would have been in his 60s when he travelled to Britannia in the year 208. There had been an increase in the amount of border raids from the Caledonian side of the frontier, which at this point was the Antonine Wall, which had been commissioned by the former emperor Antoninus Pius, and was a frontier built deeper into Britannian territory than its predecessor, Hadrian's Wall. The Caledonians were the collective name for the tribes who lived to the north of these Roman frontiers in the lands of the modern country of Scotland. This brings us into a convergence with the story that we told in our special episode about the Picts, which you can find by looking back through the directory of episodes to June 2020. Septimius Severus rebuilt Hadrian's Wall so that it was a complete stonework, where previously in parts it had been only an earthwork. Then he would push northwards to gradually incorporate the Caledonian tribes who surrendered and completely slaughter the ones who refused. However, this project was cut short because Severus fell ill and had to leave and head back to the relative safety of Eboracum to recover, which is the modern English city of York. It was the year 211, and Septimius Severus died in Eboracum in February, aged 65. The empire would pass to his sons Caracalla and his younger brother Geta, who Severus had proclaimed as his heir alongside Caracalla just a couple of years previous. Caracalla. The legacy of Caracalla's story is not an appealing one by any stretch of the imagination. We did make reference to Caracalla in previous episodes of the podcast. Firstly, we told of how he tried to get involved in the politics of the rapidly deteriorating situation in the Parthian Empire, where the empire there was on the verge of fragmenting, something we described back in episode 4. We also mentioned him in episode 41, when telling the story of the progression of public qualification for Roman citizenship, when we described the Edict of Caracalla, which granted full Roman citizenship and its associated rights to all free men of the Roman Empire. This move was not popular with everyone, but it was a progression nonetheless. So you'd be forgiven for thinking that Caracalla was a diplomatic emperor based on these things, but when we actually scrutinise his reign and his actions, we see a completely different man. Some of the stories attached to him are very unsavoury indeed. Firstly, we hear of how he did not have a strong relationship with his brother and co-ruler Jetta, and that the two of them seemed quite incapable of operating together, meaning that it was highly likely that one would try to get rid of the other. Caracalla attempted to fix the situation by organising a meeting with his brother in the company of their mother Julia Domna, wife of the previous emperor Septimius Severus. However, when the meeting took place, Caracalla brought military men with him who mercilessly slaughtered Jetta while he sought the protection of his own mother's arms. What a harrowing scene to imagine. Caracalla showed very little mercy in this act, and also in the subsequent act of executing anyone associated with his younger brother. We would soon learn that the sanctity of human life was not something highly valued in the mind of Caracalla. There are reports that as many as 20,000 were executed in this great cleansing of Caracalla's political opponents. The Senate would fall into line, as even senators were not exempt from Caracalla's wrath, as he did everything possible to erase Jetta's name from history. It seems that Caracalla would see anything as small as a whisper of Jetta could potentially be the beginning of a rebellion, and Caracalla was not prepared to allow anything to risk his position. Caracalla was a man looking to become known as a great Roman emperor. He would be looking to score great military victories and be popular, even if military campaigns were unnecessary, and even if anyone that didn't like him needed to be killed. Caracalla would campaign against the Alemanni in the first years of his sole reign as emperor, who were a Germanic tribe to the north of the Roman Empire. There is not a lot in written history describing the details of the Romans and the Alemanni during this time, but it does seem that Caracalla showed the Alemanni little mercy in his attitude towards them. Next on Caracalla's list were the eastern fringes of the empire. With the Parthian Empire in a degree of political instability, they would have been distracted when Caracalla summoned King Abgar IX of Osroene to Rome, where he was executed, allowing Caracalla to annex the kingdom of Osroene and incorporate it into the Roman Empire. A win for Caracalla there. Next, he would try a similar thing with Armenia, but the king there was not interested in falling for the same trick as his neighbour. Caracalla would have an eye on his ultimate target in the east, which was the troubled Parthian Empire. Conquest of the Parthians was the traditional great goal of the Roman Empire, and the emperor responsible would surely be immortalised in Roman folklore. However, Caracalla's legacy would be defined by something else that happened when he travelled to Egypt while preparations were being made for the Parthian campaign. The visit to Egypt was all linked into the great Roman Emperor legacy, as the aim was to emulate the great achievements of Alexander the Great of Macedon, who conquered all the Persian lands. Caracalla would model himself and his army on Alexander, and would go to Alexandria to visit the tomb of Alexander in order to take full advantage of any superstitious fortune that could be gained from this ritual pilgrimage. While in Alexandria, he discovered that a percentage of the population were actually more in favour of his brother than of him, so his solution was to have some of the population massacred. After this, he would head east to realise his imperial destiny of conquering the lands of the Parthian Empire. However, the leadership of Parthia was unstable at the time, as the two brothers Vologases VI and Artabanus IV were vying for the throne. Caracalla had to observe and decide how best to approach this issue, and it seemed that the best thing to do would be to back one of the brothers. So he offered to marry one of Artabanus's daughters on the pretext of there being a permanent peace between Rome and Parthia. But Artabanus clearly saw this as a means by which to muscle in on the Parthian throne, and refused. Caracalla then invited Artabanus to meet with him, and then when he did, Caracalla tried to have him murdered, in another completely guessable action by his own standards. Artabanus escaped with his life, and Caracalla would need another plan. So Caracalla would campaign in the area of Media, but while he was doing so, he would be murdered at the hands of a Roman soldier, which is surprising as he had done so much for his army that if he was popular with anyone it would be with them. So we learn that this soldier was put up to this assassination by the Praetorian prefect Macrinus. Macrinus would have been on campaign with Caracalla in the eastern frontier at the time, and this reaction may have been due to the fact that Macrinus felt that he was falling out of favour with Caracalla and needed to get in first before Caracalla did the same thing to him. Despite this, Macrinus would continue with the planned campaign into Parthia in 217 and met with the forces of the Parthian Empire Artabanus IV at the Battle of Nisibis. Macrinus would suffer a crushing defeat after 3 days of intense fighting. Macrinus would have to pay a huge sum of money to the Parthians and abandon their land. Elagabalus. Many of the army would not have been very impressed by the sequence of events, seeing their popular leader Caracalla murdered only to fail in the Parthian campaign. Macrinus's rule of the empire would be extremely precarious. It made sense at this time that many influential Romans would start looking to see who could be a viable replacement for Macrinus, the emperor who couldn't defeat the Parthians, a job that Caracalla might have completed. They would turn their attention towards a 14-year-old male called Bassianus, who had inherited the high priesthood to the god Elagabal in the area of Syria. Elagabal was a version of the ancient Levantine god called Baal, who we spoke about at length in the Volume 2 episode on Levantine religion, which was episode 10. It is this that gives us the name by which we distinguish him when we talk about him historically, that name being Elagabalus. Elagabalus could trace his family lineage back to the prominent members of the Severan dynasty, and there were also rumours that he was a son of Caracalla, although this could have been a claim of convenience when considering that many would have been trying to validate him having a right to challenge Macrinus as the Princeps of the Roman Empire, or as we refer to it, the Emperor. Macrinus would recognise the threat of Elagabalus and asked the Senate to declare him as an enemy of the state, and they complied. However, this seemed to be an act of correct conduct rather than a desire to support Macrinus, and many soldiers and politicians started to defect to Elagabalus's claim to be emperor, believing him to be the correct successor to Caracalla and showing their lack of faith in Macrinus. The tide of support was only going one way, and that was away from Macrinus. This would be to the point where Elagabalus would tell the Senate that he was the true successor to Caracalla, and the Senate agreeing. An army stood in approval of Elagabalus and defeat the remaining forces of Macrinus at Antioch, capturing and executing the fallen emperor. Elagabalus was a young man thrust into the role by his grandmother Julia Maessa, the sister-in-law of Septimius Severus. However, Elagabalus would do something unthinkable when he was proclaimed as emperor, which could even give us flashbacks to the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, who was alive over 1.5 millennium earlier. Akhenaten attempted to change the religion of his nation, and it was something that the Egyptian population didn't ultimately tolerate. Elagabalus attempted to replace the Roman god Jupiter, who was prominent in the Roman pantheon, with his own main deity, Elagabal. He even had a temple built on the Palatine Hill called the Elagaballium, in honour of Elagabal. Elagabalus made further controversial waves among statesmen by marrying a sacred Vestal Virgin, who were distinguished by their vow of chastity in honour of the goddess Vesta. This vow obviously meant very little to Elagabalus. He was apparently seen dressed as a barbarian priest, and even as a woman to entice the attention of men, whose company he would also seem quite keen on despite his multiple marriages to different females. He seemed truly disinterested in the standards and protocols expected of a Roman emperor, and this made him very unpopular. There was a wave of discontent throughout the empire as it fast became apparent that the appointment of Elagabalus was a big mistake, as he was being incredibly carefree financially on top of everything else. Elagabalus was forced into recognising his cousin Alexanus as the junior emperor. Elagabalus quite possibly understood that by forcing him to do this, he was setting up another young emperor in the hope that they could move Elagabalus to one side and try this experiment again with much more success. So Elagabalus had to start turning his mind to removing the threat of his own cousin. However, his loyal and highly influential grandmother, Julius Maesa, who had helped him to be recognised in the first place and who had done so much in the way of imperial duties to cover for Elagabalus, was now turning her loyalties to the younger Alexanus, and this pretty much spelt the beginning of the end. Elagabalus ordered the Praetorian Guard to execute Alexanus, but they refused and decided to honour the command to execute Elagabalus instead. Rome would have a new emperor, the 13-year-old Alexanus, who is commonly referred to as Alexander Severus. Next time on the podcast, we are going to focus on the impact of what was going on in the Roman Empire by looking at the precedent that this absolute chaos was setting, and we will look closely at the ultimate reaction to an empire going out of control. Well, once again, thanks to everyone who has tuned in and listened to this week's podcast. We've really got stuck into Rome, haven't we? And we're sort of, we've done over 20 episodes of Rome, and we're now nearing the end of it. We've not got far to go. We just need to investigate the reform of Rome, and we need to see the reign of Constantine and the ultimate split of the empire. And then we're going to summarise it all before moving on. So we're getting towards the end of it now. I reckon give us a couple of months and Rome will be a memory. And but thanks anyway for listening to this week's podcast. I think it's absolutely fascinating how the stability of the 2nd century sort of disappeared, and there was obviously like a balance of power shift, wasn't there, going on in Rome, where the army were probably gaining too much influence, and everyone else was sort of living in fear of that. And if you didn't get on with the army, you were likely to be bumped off, and that in itself had a knock-on effect to the stability of the role of Princeps. And so fascinating stuff, and great to analyse. So I hope you're enjoying this journey through the Roman Empire's history. If you are enjoying this podcast, then don't forget that you can support the podcast. You just go to the historyoftheworldpodcast.com website, click on the Patreon link and sign up to make a monthly donation. You can make a monthly donation for as little as $1 a month, or even €1 a month, or even £1 per month, as Patreon now allows you to donate in all of those currencies. And you become a lifelong member of the History of the World podcast Illuminati, and that's your reward. And also, if you explore the site, you can see how you can qualify for certain perks, gifts and merchandise, which we're always happy to send out to those of you who are kind enough to offer support to the podcast. If making a financial contribution is not possible at the moment, we know a lot of you are going through some hard times at the moment with everything that's gone on this year, then then please do rate and review the podcast, because that has a lot of value in itself, and I can't tell you how much value that does have, because it does make it sound like we're always begging for money. It really isn't always about that. Sometimes it's just about a wave of support, making the podcast as popular as possible, and that can be just as valuable. So don't forget to do that if you haven't done that already. Now, some of the members of the History of the World podcast Illuminati are entitled to ask a question, which I will attempt to answer during the course of the podcast. Now, don't forget, I don't know everything. In fact, I don't know much, to be quite honest with you, but I try and educate myself as much as possible so that I do sound like I know what I'm talking about. And so I precariously invite people to ask questions, and Mandy Kirk, a great friend of the podcast now, who has been kind enough to actually identify that mysterious grub truck creature as a Banksy stencil, which is something that puzzled us for about 2 years. She was the one that offered the solution. She's also qualified to ask a question, and it's a great question. I'm going to read it out. She's put, "Hi Chris, I'm honoured to get to participate in your project. I'm curious about the historical roots of the mythical Amazons. I have heard that the Greeks who encountered Central European horseback riding Scythians romanticised what seemed impossible to them, fighting women, and over time that impression became the fantastical literary one-breasted tribe of warrior women. What do we know about the sources of that myth?" And that's been written by Mandy Kirk. Well, Mandy, one of the things I've personally not stumbled across the Amazons in my journey in writing this podcast, but obviously they were very prominent to the Greeks. They were very well known to the Greeks, and certainly on a lot of their artwork they portrayed the Amazons, and I've endeavoured to try and put it into a nutshell what I believe the origins of it was, and maybe even introduce some of my ideas about the impact that it had on Greek society as well. The fact that these warrior women existed, because I think you've rightly identified, Mandy, that the whole concept of these warrior women has had some real sort of underlying connotations to methods of thinking, and this almost something we have to be very careful about talking about, and that's the difference between men and women, and how we identify and address that difference in society, certainly even in ancient society as much as we do in modern society. Now, anyone that listens to me knows that I'm incredibly sceptical about everything that I come across, everything that I read, and I'm always looking to take the logical approach to everything, but at the same time I don't want to be too logical to the point where I'm closed-minded. You have to be open-minded, because you're talking about history, and the moment you pretend you know everything about everything, someone pops up and says, well, you weren't there, so how on earth can you tell us what was going on? The one thing I'm struggling to have is this whole thing about them being one-breasted. I mean, for me, what is all that about? The concept that I've read about in terms of this one-breasted thing is that the Amazon women cut off one of their breasts so that they could be expert archers, because the breast was just getting in the way. Unfortunately, you can't be a good archer if you've got a breast getting in the way. So the best thing to do is get rid of it. But honestly, how do you get rid of a breast in ancient times without dying? Basically, it's like, for me, I'm struggling to have that. So one-breasted women, I don't know where that has come from. Perhaps I ought to read a bit more and find out where I can believe that concept come from. Certainly, we know that the Amazons were mentioned in Homer's Iliad, but they played a very minor role in it, and so of course we get a lot of as I was saying, a lot of depictions of the Amazons in Greek art, but it appears that in Homer's work that the Amazons really didn't play that much of a prominent role, and it was only in later adaptations of Homer's work that we find that the Amazons are much more a part of the Trojan Wars, that they're very much involved in the Trojan Wars. So when we go back into the origins of it, we have to go back to the Iliad. Then the questions get asked again: how real was the Trojan War? How real was Homer? You know, with all this mythologizing about Greek origins, and we see this in all the ancient societies, that they have a mythological origin theory right back to the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. So it's very, very hard to believe anything that you read in any of these mythological writings. So it could be that the Amazons were just simply created out of someone's imagination, and that was it. But if I left it like that, that would all be very boring. So let's have a look at some other things in terms of Greek mythology, certainly, and how it evolved into the writings of Herodotus and then Thucydides in turn. Certainly, Thucydides would have probably not been too interested in the Amazons, really believing that they were not scientifically proven, as Herodotus may have been quite attracted to the idea of it, being as he enjoyed the mythology of things. And if we look at one of the supposed pupils of Homer, a man called Arctinus of Miletus, I read something that he wrote which was fantastic. He's put it's written: Arctinus of Miletus added a doomed romance, and this goes back to the Trojan Wars, in which now the Amazons are playing a very vital role in. And it describes how the Greek Achilles killed the Amazonian queen Penthesilea in hand-to-hand combat. Only to fall instantly in love with her as her helmet slipped to reveal the beautiful face underneath. I mean, come on, goodness me. What can I say about that? This is obviously written by a man who wants to probably downplay the role of a woman in society as a baby making pretty little flower. No. The Amazons were warrior women. They were supposed to be fierce, at the head of their society, at the front line of battles. And I don't think they would want to be portrayed as ones that men would instantly fall in love with their beauty. That's certainly not what they're all about at all. So you can get a view of how Greeks were trying to skew this into something that suited them. And it's almost like men fear admitting that there was this warrior female race by having the right that they were defeated by the Greeks. And this is almost maybe a method of putting female into that inferior role of the two sexes. So it suits us to say that women are inferior to men, so that we can put them in their place as the baby making machines of Greece. But then also, like, if that sounds degrading to women, and certainly if we go into Spartan society a little bit later on, we can identify that women were probably viewed upon as baby-making machines, but certainly men were degraded as well in that society into just simply being machines of military purpose. They were bred to serve in the army of the Spartans. So you could equally say that men were also being degraded in those kind of societies as well. But certainly I do believe that there probably was a desire by Greek men to put women in their place, and by portraying the Amazons or the Amazonians as a warrior race who were defeated, I think feeds that point of view. But before we go saying that the Amazonians never existed and it was all a load of old rubbish, a load of Greek mythology just made up, we should have a look at the differing point of view, which basically I think starts with the writings of Herodotus, who wrote a great deal of stuff, and some of it is believed to be true, and some of it is believed to be made up, and that's always been a matter for contention. We've heard of this father of lies theory, but Herodotus' writing has survived the test of time. It's one of the earliest historians that we have access to knowledge of, and Herodotus tells the story of a race of people called the Sarmatians, who he came across in his travels, who came from the Black Sea regions, like around the Eurasian steppe, and he described them as a people who were, where women were a very prominent part of their society. And so here we see that there could be a link between the warrior women. All we need to do is really see if there are any possibilities around the sort of the Greek sphere of influence, their known world, where women were warriors. So it surely isn't that hard. So Herodotus was one of the people who identified that the Sarmatians qualified for that. Now, Herodotus said that he never met an Amazonian woman or a warrior woman from the Sarmatian culture, but certainly we know through excavations that the Sarmatians existed. And then if we fast forward to the 1990s, we find that there was a very famous excavation from a place called Pokrovka in Russia. And they found some mounds, what we call kurgans, if we go back to our Indo-European roots. If we believe in the kurgan theory, that's linked to the same kind of thing. I'm going to read this from the article that I found in Science magazine. It says, the most striking discovery at Pokrovka has been the skeletons of women buried with swords and daggers. One young woman, bow-legged from riding horseback, wore around her neck an amulet in the form of a leather pouch containing a bronze arrowhead. At her right side was an iron dagger. At her left, a quiver holding more than 40 arrows, tipped with bronze. In the earlier Sauramatian graves, that's the same culture, same as the Sarmatians, the skeletons revealed one suggestive Amazonian attribute. The men and women, at an average of 5'10" and 5'6" respectively, were taller and more robust than normal people at that time. Of more importance, the new discoveries are forcing anthropologists and historians to reconsider the status and role of women in the Eurasian nomad societies of the first millennium BC. The research, she said, showed that women seemed to have more wealth, power and status in these cultures than anyone had thought, and certain women, perhaps the elite of the tribe, appeared to be trained from an early age to be warriors on horseback. So this suggests that any Greek mythology about Amazonians could be based on actual fact, on the fact that they actually came across this strange society from the Eurasian steppe where women were actually fighting alongside men, were like equal in war, in warrior culture, and were somewhat larger than the women that they had in their own society, sort of giving off this idea of these broad-shouldered and vicious and well-built women capable of waging war on other people. This Amazonian image that we get in modern society, this caricature of an Amazonian woman. So that could be where the mythology comes from. It could come from the actual Scythian warriors, where women appear, through archaeological research, to have been somewhat equal to men in terms of the warrior culture. So perhaps that's what it is. It sounds feasible to me, but of course I don't know, and I'd be very interested in your opinion. But thanks so much, Mandy Kirk, for the question, and it was a pleasure to answer it. And I don't really have a lot of knowledge about it, so I've had to sort of make it up on the fly, really. But I hope it was entertaining nonetheless, and interesting and insightful. And anyone now that wants to read more about it can possibly go and do that for themselves now. Let's quickly fly through some messages and reviews. I've got a message here from CJ. Hi Chris, my name is CJ and I'm from Birmingham, UK. Just wanted to send you a quick email to let you know how much I'm enjoying the podcast so far. I'm on Volume 1, Episode 14. It's been a joy to listen to. I can't wait to go through the years to your latest releases. It's really opened up my eyes on the history of the world. This is the first podcast I've actually downloaded on Spotify. I would normally just listen to music whenever I'm out on walks or driving, but that has now changed. I am hooked. Anyway, look forward to binging through all the next episodes. Hope you have a great weekend, and once again, thank you for making a great podcast. Kind regards, CJ. See, so full of kindness, my email inbox, unbelievable. Douglas T. Easel has written, hi Chris, Doug from Montana, USA here. I've just started listening to your podcast. I'm up to episode 9 in volume 1 and I'm really enjoying it. You've done a nice job of distilling a great deal of very technical information into a way that is informative and entertaining. I love your humour. Also, the echoing introduction to each section gives me a chuckle every time I hear it. Thanks for all your hard work. Keep it up. Yeah, I love the echoing introduction to each section. I didn't nick that from Rex Factor whatsoever. Beth has written in saying, hello there, my name is Beth and I just recently discovered your podcast. I enjoy reading and listening to anthropology topics. I'm on volume 1 episode 5 and I'm very much enjoying your podcast. However, it's sometimes hard to remember everything. I was wondering if you would send me some titles of your favourite books that you have read or in reference in order to make this podcast specifically about anthropology. Thanks so much. When we're talking about paleoanthropology, I would strongly recommend web resources such as Smithsonian and the likes of, purely for the fact that is an ever-changing science, and a lot of the you can get good publications. Like I did sort of use The History of the World, edited by John Whitney Hall, for some sort of guidance, but in actual fact that is an old book, and so you have to absolutely validate and even in some cases dismiss some of the work within that book, because we know better now than when that was first published. So web resources, I think, are the best for that kind of thing, and it might sound like a lazy answer, but in my mind that is the right answer. But thanks for the email, Beth. And finally, I'm going to wrap up with a review from Luke539 from Great Britain, who's put, inspiring. Thank you so much for creating such a fascinating and truly remarkable podcast. I've taken great pleasure in every episode. I know some may be bored on the Romans, and with the risk of lengthening it out, will you be covering religion during the Roman period, the transformation from a largely pagan society to that of a monotheistic society, and the rise of power of the various popes is a truly fascinating tale, and one that I have not had the chance to hear. Keep up the amazing job. This is truly a gift to the world. For ages to run. Regards, Luke. We are fast approaching Constantine and that reign, which is absolutely key to the change in Roman religion. Absolutely key period that. But then also after, I think, off the top of my head, I should have looked before I answered this question. Sorry. I think we're going to go into to cultures of the Eurasian steppe, including the Scythians and the Huns and the Celts and all that kind of thing. And then at some point we are going to be looking at religion, because it's very much during this period that we start seeing the emergence of modern religions as we recognise them today. So there will be a couple of episodes that tackle the monotheistic religions versus other religions that were emerging, such as Buddhism and Hinduism, for example. So that has to be looked at, and we will be exploring that. Buddhism, of course. We will be exploring all of those at some point during Volume 3, and probably elaborating on it in future volumes as well. So, very good point. Thank you very much, Luke. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up now because I've spent long enough in your ear holes. You're going to start charging me rent if I stay any longer. So I'm going to get out now and move on and leave you in peace for another week, where we will rejoin and continue the Roman story. But thank you very much for joining me this week. And until next week, be good. Do you want more from the History of the World podcast? Then visit our website, historyoftheworldpodcast.com. You can join our discussion forum and find us on social media. Support the podcast for as little as $1 per month by clicking the Patreon link. Email the show at historyoftheworldpodcast@mail.com. The best ones will be read out. Be sure to rate and review the show wherever you listen to us.